What started with a hijacked bus, desperate passengers, and special forces ended as one of the biggest cover-ups in Israeli history. One morning, the country woke up to headlines about a daring overnight rescue. But some of Israel's most powerful operatives had buried the truth. And soon, the country faced a showdown between the most existential issues of statehood, security, and morality. So, what really happened after the hijacking of Bus 300? As the spring of 1984 rolled around, Israel was on edge, and the country was about to be shaken to its core. In the early evening of April 12, 1984, 44 passengers were on a public bus along a stretch of road bordering the Mediterranean Sea. Among them were 4 young Palestinians. Bus 300 was on its usual route from Tel Aviv to Ashkelon, a city just north of the Gaza Strip. But nothing about this ride unfolded as expected. As the bus neared its final destination, pandemonium erupted. The 4 young Palestinians took control. Holding a weapon to the driver's throat, they ordered him to floor it and drive south to Gaza. Meanwhile, Israeli security forces were in hot pursuit. They followed the bus into the Gaza Strip, where it ground to a halt. The driver ran for his life, followed by a few other passengers. But others couldn't move quickly enough before the hijackers shut the doors, trapping them inside. Israel's top security brass had rushed to the scene. The defense minister, the head of the IDF Special Forces, and the leader of Israel's internal security service, the Shabak. Think of the Shabak as Israel's FBI. It manages security matters within Israel's borders, including capturing foreign spies and dealing with domestic terror threats. And in 1984, the head of the Shabak was a legendary figure. Avraham Shalom had been part of the Mossad team that captured the notorious fugitive Eichmann back in the 1960s. He had a reputation for making grown men cry. On the ground in Gaza, the Shabak took charge. For hours, the negotiators tried to convince the hijackers to release the passengers and surrender. They believed that with a little more time, the standoff would end peacefully. But others were growing restless. Negotiations were stalling. It was time to act. In the early hours of April 13th, the Army's special forces stormed the bus. One of the passengers, a female soldier named Irit Portugues, was tragically hit by IDF fire and succumbed to her wounds. 2 of the hijackers were taken out in the raid. The other 2 were taken prisoner. In the chaos, they were roughed up, beaten, hit in the head. They were kids, not even 18 years old. Within moments, it was apparent to the army that they were no longer a threat. But they were handed over to the Shabak for further questioning. Avraham Shalom was among the Shabak officials conducting this frenzied, on-the-spot interrogation. Riled up and angry, some operatives began pummeling the detainees. But the hijacking was over and the passengers were safe. Shalom's work was done, so he turned to leave. But as he walked away, he looked at one of his commanders and said words that would come to haunt the country. Techasel Otam, eliminate them. In the chaos and the anger and the fury, a man hardened by years of fighting in the shadows had crossed the line. One of Shalom's men ran after him. He warned Shalom that photographers had snapped images showing the hijackers alive and unwounded after they'd been handed over to Shabak custody. Alex Levak, a photographer for the newspaper Hadashot, had followed security forces into Gaza to document the hijacking. He took photos of everything he could see, including 2 large men leading a young man away from the bus. Levak assumed the young man was a passenger being brought to safety. But when a Shabak operative tried to confiscate the film, Levak realized something didn't smell right. So he stuffed the film roll into his sock and refused to hand it over. And Levak wasn't the only one with a camera. Shmuel Rahmani, a photographer for the newspaper Ma'ariv, had also captured a shot of one of the young hijackers being led away. But Shalom didn't react. Not to the warning, not to the cameras, not to what it could mean for him or anyone involved. And so, the hijackers were taken to their fate. Shalom's commander ordered his men to load the 2 cousins into a van. They drove them to an abandoned field and beat them with rocks and iron bars until they lay bloody and lifeless. Most of Israel didn't even know the hijacking had occurred until the news broke on April 13th. And the headlines claimed that all 4 hijackers were eliminated or wounded when the army stormed the bus. The military censor banned the publication of Levak and Rahmani's photos, or even a whisper of their existence. But just 2 days later, the New York Times reported that Hadashot had a photograph of one of the captured hijackers, alive and unharmed. This story sent shockwaves through Israel. Taking the life of a prisoner who had already surrendered went against Israel's own policies. And capturing a terror operative alive wasn't just morally important, it was critical for gathering intelligence. Avraham Shalom felt he had to protect himself, so he went straight to the top. No one else was in the room when Shalom met with Shamir, but one of Shamir's deputies later claimed that Shalom told the prime minister it was the defense minister who gave the order to finish them off. When the defense minister heard this, he was stunned. He had never given such an order. So he launched a secret commission of inquiry led by a former army general. A commission so confidential that when an Israeli newspaper reported its formation, the state shut the paper down for 4 days. But Shalom knew the truth would destroy him, so he and his inner circle began weaving an elaborate web of deceit. He planted one of his most loyal aides, Yossi Ginosal, inside the commission. By day, Ginosal questioned the witnesses, but at night, he met secretly with Shalom, sharing details about the investigation and helping coach the witnesses, who all stuck to the same lie. No order had been given to finish off the hijackers. Yes, they had been beaten, but not by us. Instead, they pinned the blame on Brigadier General Yitzhak Mordechai, the head of the Army Special Forces. At first, Shalom wasn't comfortable with blaming a distinguished officer like Mordechai, but Ginosal convinced him that the only way Shalom would walk away clean was if someone else took the blame. And Mordechai had struck the hijackers with the butt of his pistol after the raid on the bus. He was the perfect fall guy. The Shabak testimony was airtight. Not a single witness deviated from the conspiracy. By the end of May 1984, the commission's existence was finally officially acknowledged. Israeli newspapers were at last allowed to publish the damning photos. The commission concluded that the 2 surviving hijackers had been beaten shortly after they were captured, which was true. But the rest of its conclusions were based on fraud. That Shabak operatives weren't responsible, that no one had ordered the hijackers' elimination, and that Yitzhak Mordechai should be investigated by military police as the man responsible. But many questions lingered. So the Attorney General established a second commission, this one led by the state prosecutor, to dig deeper into what happened.
לאחר הפרשה ובעקבות פרסומה בכלי התקשורת, החליט שר הביטחון אז משה ארנס להקים ועדת חקירה לפרשת קו 300. במסקנותיה של ועדת זורע נקבע כי שני המחבלים מתו כתוצאה ממכות של כלי נשק בראשם, ואולם לא נקבע מי אחראי ישירות למותם.
But the Shabak witnesses held fast to their falsehoods, and this second inquiry yielded nothing new. In 1985, Yitzhak Mordechai went on trial. He was acquitted, but only after a bitter legal fight that tarnished his reputation. It seemed like the story was over, until 3 whistleblowers came forward. Reuven Chazak, Peleg Radai, and Rafi Malka were senior officials of the Shabak. Chazak was Shalom's second in command. He hadn't been on the scene of the hijacking, so he was never called to testify. But he knew about the cover-up. He tried to convince Shalom to end it, to no avail. Radai was the head of the foreigners' wing. Like Chazak, he also hadn't witnessed the hijacking. But Shalom leaned on him to stop foreign press from printing the photos, which made it clear to Radai that the Shabak testimony was a lie. Rafi Malka, the head of the administrative wing, hadn't known about the cover-up, but he started hearing whisperings inside the Shabak. So he began investigating. Finally, in September 1985, Chazak told him the whole story, and their consciences wouldn't let it go. The trio begged Shalom to resign. Instead, he went to Prime Minister Shimon Peres and warned him that a rebellion was brewing at the Shabak. The Prime Minister invited Chazak to a meeting. Chazak poured out the entire disturbing saga, the murders, the cover-up, the lies. He thought Peres was on his side, but in a second meeting, Peres told him he believed Shalom's story. Chazak, Radai, and Malka were devastated, and soon after, Shalom dismissed all 3. Their careers were over, but giving up wasn't an option. On March 9, 1986, almost 2 years after the hijacking, the trio met secretly with Israel's Attorney General and 3 of his deputies. The scale of the cover-up left Israel's top prosecutors in shock. Zamir went straight to Peres and told him he was going to bring charges against Avraham Shalom for murder. Peres picked up the phone to call Shalom and Ginosal. He warned them he couldn't stop the prosecutors from charging them. But Shalom pushed back. If this went public, it would spark a national scandal, one that could take everyone down, even the Prime Minister. Because this wasn't the first time that someone had met their end under questionable circumstances at the hands of Israel's secret services. Peres and Yitzhak Shamir, who was now serving as Israel's foreign minister, knew that an investigation would uncover unsavory methods used by the Shabak. And the press had already speculated that Shamir knew the truth about Bus 300. And if the truth came to light, Israel's entire government could collapse. So Peres leaned on Zamir to drop the case. But Zamir insisted. Charges had to be brought. And when news broke that the Attorney General asked the police to investigate a high-ranking security official, the country was shocked. And when that official turned out to be Avraham Shalom himself, they were floored. The head of an Israeli security agency had never been investigated, ever. They were responsible for Israel's most fragile and urgent need, its security. So they answered only to the prime minister. Their files were secret, their operations clandestine, and their methods were never questioned, until now. Zamir had become a thorn in the government side, so he was fired and replaced by a new attorney general. But he also vowed to bring the case to court. And just 2 weeks after Harish was appointed, the country was flabbergasted by the news that Israel's president had preemptively pardoned Shalom and 3 of his deputies. And because the pardons came before any charges were even filed, the case was now legally moot. Shalom resigned as the head of the Shabak without admitting any guilt. Israel's legal community erupted in protest. They argued that granting a pardon before a trial had even started undermined the rule of law. They challenged the pardons in court, but the Supreme Court ultimately ruled they were legal, and 7 more Shabak officials involved in the cover-up were also pardoned later. 2 terror operatives had met their end outside the bounds of law, and in the eyes of some, no one paid the price. But Bus 300 left its mark. In the years that followed, a special commission was set up to investigate the Shabak's techniques and methods, and to set clear boundaries on how far they could go. It wasn't until 1996 that anyone else admitted their involvement in the events of Bus 300. Ehud Yatom, the Shabak official who carried out Shalom's "finish them" order, told an Israeli newspaper that he carried out the deadly beatings. He'd been pardoned a decade earlier. To this day, he's the only person who has ever admitted his involvement. Rafi Malka, Peleg Radai, and Reuven Chazak were never honored for their role in uncovering the scandal. Avraham Shalom later on acknowledged some responsibility, but he insisted to the end that his actions were justified. His version of events was a murky mix of truth and fiction. According to Shalom, the army had already beaten the hijackers badly before handing them over to the Shabak. And when he heard they were near lifeless, he told his subordinate to put them out of their misery. He claimed he had never even seen the hijackers.
למה בעצם נתת את ההוראה להרוג אותם?
כי לא רציתי עוד מחבלים חיים בבית משפט. זה היה מגביר את הטרור. גם ככה זה הגביר.
להרוג את המחבלים ב-300 היה ראוי?
לפי התוצאה לא.
רק לפי התוצאה?
רק לפי התוצאה.
The only thing he ever admitted was this. He would have never given the order to finish them off if he had realized that photographs existed. But Bus 300 wasn't just a scandal about an extrajudicial murder and a cover-up. It forced a fundamental reckoning of how far a people were willing to go to guarantee their safety. Because Israel had faced relentless attempts at its total annihilation since the moment of its inception. Endless attacks on communities and civilians. The deadly Arab army invasion aimed at eliminating Israel from the river to the sea. Decades of terror raids, hijackings, the slaughter of civilians, athletes, mothers, fathers, children, babies. War after war after war. Israel's soil was stained with the blood of thousands of Jews. And so a nation under threat had made a trade-off: security at almost any cost. And for years, Israelis had trusted the establishment, but Bus 300 smashed that trust into smithereens. For the first time, Israelis looked head-on into the abyss, into the dark side that all countries that believe in moral red lines have confronted. What happens when that morality clashes with the harsh reality of what it takes to defeat terror? When your enemy doesn't have any red lines? When you're living in a world that isn't black and white, but a hazy gray zone? The toll that the fight against terror takes on its fighters. What we lose as a people and as a society when we walk away from the rules we make for ourselves. The rules that govern our worst impulses. The rules that set us apart from the adversary who doesn't believe in limits. And whether it's even possible to win without becoming the enemy. Israelis ask themselves some hard questions. with some painful answers. And the Bus 300 affair still reverberates in Israeli society because it forces us to ask some hard questions about responsibility and accountability today, about how far a country under threat can go to keep its people safe, and whether anyone, no matter how powerful, should be above the law.